The night is dark and full of terrors. In today's project, we're going to make a flaming sword. Pretty awesome, right? Do I recommend that you make a flaming sword? Heck no! That being said, let me show you exactly how to make one. As you can see, the sword is made exactly like they did in the medieval times, with butane, Velcro, and PVC. There's also a rechargeable lighter in there. Here's a close-up of the recharge in action. When making your sword, the butane nozzle should face away from the blade to get the biggest flame. I'll show you why in this little experiment. Here we're using a plasma lighter, and we'll light the butane with the nozzle facing upward. The butane is coming out as a gas in this orientation, and the flame is only about a foot high. Next, we'll flip the butane canister over so the nozzle is facing downward. Now it's coming out as a liquid, and the flame is much more impressive. I started with this sword from eBay. Remove the pommel by pulling it away from the grip. Then cut the hilt lengthwise, through the thickness of the grip. There's a tang in there, so you don't want to cut completely through the entire grip. Turn the sword over and complete the vertical cut there too. Then cut around the hilt near the guard. It doesn't need to be flush with the guard. Use a screwdriver to pry it apart. Remove the debris, and then also remove the nut on the tang. Then slide the guard down the tang. Next, we're going to use a 1 1/2 inch PVC tube as the hilt. We're using this because it makes a good-sized grip and will be large enough to accommodate this butane canister. Cut 10 5/8 inches of that PVC. And then cut it lengthwise in half. Put a registration mark on it so you'll know exactly how it fits back together. We'll want to cut a 1/4 inch slice down one of those halves in order to accommodate the fuel line. The fuel line will rest between the clamshell like this when it's done. Cutting that slice now. Next, cut a 3/4 inch PVC pipe the length of your tang, and then cut it in half lengthwise. Glue that piece inside the first piece of PVC. This will support the tang. I'm using a 2-part epoxy. After gluing the 3/4 inch PVC into the handle, glue the tang on top of it. It'll look like this when it's done. The next step is to disassemble the lighter. The link to this lighter is in the description. After removing the bottom screw, slide the cover down. You'll need to depress the button before the housing will slide free, so be careful. Here I'm removing the tape to free up the button wiring. Then remove 4 pins holding the lighter together. I'm using needle nose pliers to push the pin on one side, and then flipping the lighter over to pull the pin out on the other. Remove the electrode cover, we won't be using that. Put the lighter over the PVC hilt to determine where the button should be. Mark that location on the PVC, and then drill out an opening. Drill a pilot hole in the middle of the guard, and then widen it to 1/4 inch. This will be the opening for the fuel line. Drill 2 more holes on the sides of the first one. This will accommodate the ignition wires. This is how it should look when it's done. Trim off any unnecessary plastic from the lighter if needed to make it fit more easily in the handle. For this sword, I needed to extend the ignition wires a little bit, so I'm soldering a strand of Ethernet cable wiring to each lead. I'm using heat shrink tubing to cover the connection points. Wrap the lighter with electrical tape so it looks like this. Then cut approximately 18 inches of 1/8 inch fuel line tubing. We'll want the fuel line to be straight, so tape it down and then hit it with a heat gun. A blow dryer will also work. Slide the ignition wires through the smaller holes, and then slide the fuel line through the larger hole. Trim off the ends of the ignition wires so that only 1 inch is remaining. Put the butane canister in the hilt, connect the fuel line to it, then cut the fuel line flush with the guard. Next, cut off the end of an 1/8 inch hose barb adapter. Pull the fuel line back out of the hole, soften the end of it by squeezing it with pliers, and then insert the brass barb into the fuel line. The brass barb will help to protect the fuel line from burning. Reinsert the fuel line into the guard. It should look like this when you're done. Glue the button to its hole. Glue the fuel line about halfway down the handle. The next step is to repurpose the spark gap which was provided with the lighter. We don't need this nub, so I'm scoring a line around it with a cutoff wheel. I then use pliers to snap it off, and then file it down. Feed the 2 wires into the spark gap, then glue the spark gap to the guard. Next, knead up some epoxy putty and cover the wires going into the spark gap. This will help to protect the wires. Next, we're going to work on the pommel, which will be the control for the fuel output. Roughen the inner end of the pommel, and a 1/4 inch inner diameter washer. Glue the washer just under halfway onto the pommel like this. Use the remaining half of the PVC that we cut earlier to hold up the tang to measure a section between the butane and the end of the hilt. Save the other section of this cut as we'll be using that too. Glue the 2 sections together back to back so it looks like this. Adjust the height of the pommel mount so your pommel will be half the height of the hilt. Here I can see my pommel will be too high, so I trim off a bit of the pommel mount. Next, feed the fuel line through the washer, then rest the pommel on the mount. We need to strengthen the tubing in order to depress the butane nozzle. I've measured the distance from the washer to the nozzle so that we'll know how much 5/16 brass tubing to cut. Slip the brass tubing over the fuel line when done. We need to create a guide for the pommel sliding action. I'm epoxying some cardboard to stiffen it.
1 hour later.
I was planning to thicken it with several folds, but it turned out I didn't need that many. It was rigid enough after 2 folds after the epoxy dried. Here I'm checking the size that I need, and I'm cutting it out. Next I cut a slot in the pommel, just wide enough to accommodate the thickness of the cardboard. Cut a notch on both sides of the pommel mount to fit the cardboard, then glue the cardboard in those notches. Glue the bottom of the pommel mount and put it in the hilt. When the glue is dry, slide the slots that we just cut in the pommel over the cardboard on the mount. Ensure that you can work it back and forth. To secure the fuel line more thoroughly to the butane nozzle, I'm using these 1/4 inch spring hose clamps. Now I'm using duct tape as the hinge for the hilt. Now we're on to wrapping the hilt. I'm using goat leather, purchased at Hobby Lobby. I'm using my level as a straight edge and as a thickness guide for the straps. This strip will be long enough for 2 wraps of the handle. We're not going to spiral the leather as we want to be able to access the interior of the hilt later on. I'm using white glue and spreading it with a cotton swab with the end cut off. For the first wrap, I'm overlapping the edge to cover the end of the hilt. Now I'm using a rubber band to hold it in place while it dries. Repeating this process several more times. I start the wraps on the fuel line, making sure to cover the previous row. I then leave about 1.5 inch lip unglued to anything, and then work on the next row. This is the last row now, and I'm not doing anything special with the button. The button will be hidden from view, but you can feel it when you're holding the sword. The glue in the leather will not interfere with the button's operation. Once the glue is dry, remove the rubber bands. I've stuck Velcro to the underside of the lip that we left earlier. I'm now laying down the matching side on top of the first one. Remove the plastic backing to expose the sticky side, and then close the hilt so the Velcro attaches at the right spot. I don't like the plasticky look of the leather, so I'm using 60 grit sandpaper to give it a more worn out look. And now it's playtime. The night is dark and full of terrors. And now a very important message from my favoriteest youngest daughter.
If you like this video, click up here to see another one of his. Also, click down here to subscribe and click bell notifications so you're notified of his newest videos. Also, don't trust your children with weapons. Unless you're the ones that give it to them. Then it's perfectly fine. And see you next time. Yeah!
Good job.